Okay, well, hi everyone. Um, I think as we all know, tonight's book club review is of the recently published The People on the Beach by Rosie White House. We're honoured to have Rosie with us tonight, who will talk to us about her fantastically researched account of the seaborne refugee operations to deliver Jewish survivors to what would become Israel. Rosie is a British historical researcher, journalist, and author who documents a moment in history when more than 1,000 Holocaust survivors gathered on a beach and clambered aboard a rickety ship that was stuffed far beyond its capacity, sailing to the British Mandate of Palestine across the Mediterranean. The survivors braved Italian authorities, a British naval blockade, and an oddly hostile reception by those who believed that they must have done some wrong in order to still be alive. During her journey, interviewing survivors, relatives, archivists, and historians, Rosie learned about stories not often told elsewhere, including the work of the Jewish Brigade of the British Army, a unit of soldiers who had effectively gone AWOL to help Holocaust survivors escape to Palestine, and of Italian partisans and ordinary townspeople in helping overcrowded refugee ships sail, a story commemorated in Leon Uris's novel Exodus. Rosie's book is a brilliantly written, welcome addition to the literature of the Holocaust and its aftermath. Questions can be posted on the chat line and definitely be asked later. Rosie, over to you.
Well, firstly, thank you for those extremely nice words. And I also wanted to say again, thank you to Yad Vashem UK, because 2 years ago, I was actually at Yad Vashem on one of your courses, and that has helped me so much in the last 2 years in the educational work I've been doing. So thank you so much for that. I know many of you here have read the book, but I think for the benefit of those who haven't, I'll just give a quick overview. And I think we should start by asking some quite simple questions. And the best one to start with is, where is the beach and who are the people? Well, the beach is on the Italian Riviera, and I'm a freelance journalist and I have many different hats, and one of them is a travel writer, and I'm extremely lucky to have as my travel writing patch both the French and the Italian Riviera. And I was researching my Brat guidebook to the Italian Riviera when I stumbled across a newspaper cutting which described how over 1,000 Jews had arrived on this remote little beach in Vado, which is to the west of Savona and Genoa, and that they had sailed away in the middle of the night to try to run the Royal Naval blockade of Palestine. Well, firstly, I was amazed that I'd never heard of this story. And as a journalist, my first instinct was to get in my car, and my husband and I went down to the beach and we started asking questions of people on the beach, and we found a fisherman who remembered the story. So I'd stood the story up, and then I thought, well, that's fine. I'll just go home with one click and I'll buy a book and it'll tell me everything I need to know. Well, lo and behold, I had to buy literally hundreds of books, and I had to write it myself. Which was ironic. But the thing that drove me forward in regards to the beach was that I was very surprised that I couldn't find anybody who knew about the story. My husband's father, my father-in-law, was in shipping in Italy, and he represented Italian shipyards, particularly those on the Ligurian coastline. So many of the friends that we have in Italy are go back generations and are involved in shipping as well. So I was extremely surprised when I just got blank faces when I began to ask questions in Italy. And I realized that as a journalist, I was onto a great story. It was kind of obvious, and that was like a red rag to a bull, I have to say. But then the real big challenge that I had was, who are the people? Now, completely naively, I started off thinking that I would find a passenger list. My eldest daughter, she works for the UN, and she said to me, "Mommy, you're an idiot. It's a refugee boat. They don't keep passenger lists." At which time I thought, oh my God. And then I thought the story was literally dead in the water. Excuse the pun, because I thought, I can't tell this story unless I can find the people. I recognized immediately the story would be in the people. And I was extremely lucky. The people were not, because when they did try to run the Royal Naval blockade, they were arrested and taken to the Atlit detention centre where their names were recorded. I then later discovered with my other daughter a publication in a newspaper in Tel Aviv, which listed their names, but also most crucially with the names of their parents, because many of these people had changed their names. So I was only began to be able to trace them through records of their parents. One thing I will say here is lots of people like to ask me what was the story that I found was the most interesting. And actually that was the story that I couldn't find. I lived in Romania immediately after the revolution for 18 months, and I've always had a soft spot for Romania. And I really wanted to discover the stories of the Romanians who sailed on the Josiah Wedgwood. And I was unable to do so. And this was not for want of trying, because the list that you see of names at the back of the book was literally a hard labor. I searched for hours and hours and hours for everybody on the list, trying to not always search for the people whose names began with A, but starting with different letters. And I did search incessantly for the Romanians. They had, for some reason, their names made into Slavic names, which began to make it impossible. And I find this a great sadness, because it means that I wasn't able to tell the story of Transnistria. And one of the things that really concerns me about the Holocaust is, with the emphasis on Holocaust Memorial Day being on the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, that we concentrate on only a few selected stories, and those like Transnistria will just literally slip off and not be told. So I was very sorry about that. But one of the things that has been great about the book and regard to the people is that one or two people have begun to contact me and to say, hey, I know that person is a relative. But for those of you who had read the book, I will say that there's one gentleman there called Jack Burstein, who I watched his testimony for about 12 hours. And amazingly enough, last week, his daughter got in contact with me and said, hey, that's my dad. So it is working. Now, once I'd began to find the identities of the people, at the same time, I've been simultaneously researching into this story. There are two books about it. Yehuda Bauer had written his own book, but this was much out of date because it was written in the time of the Cold War, when you couldn't actually go to visit many of these places, and let alone start knocking on people's doors and asking them what they remembered about the Holocaust and whether they were Jewish or not. So there was a lot of track record that I had to do. And then again, it played into my methodology being a journalist, because my natural reaction was to get in my car and go and visit the places that the people had come from. It wasn't to go to an archive. In fact, all the archives that I really needed were now available on my computer. So this is a story of a journey. It's not just a story of the past. It's a story of how the Holocaust plays into the present. And I think that to me that was very important, and it also helped me because in doing this book, it was self-funded. I didn't have any grants. I had no help from anybody, and I had to write the book to find out what it was. So it did help in the actual writing of the book, because I was able to pay with it slightly with the journalism that I was doing on the side at the time. Now, the book divides roughly into four chunks. The first chunk is set in Eastern Europe and tells the story of the experience that those people who were liberated further to the east, many of them who'd been hidden, many of them who'd been partisans who were fighting in the forests, their experiences. And I myself was taken aback when I began to realize that these liberation stories began so early. The first chapter of my book begins in February 1944, and it's in those immediate months afterwards that people were choosing to, realizing, not necessarily choosing, were realizing that they could not stay in Eastern Europe and they had to leave, and they were beginning to make journeys across what was a war zone, and where camps like Auschwitz were working at full pelt. So it just goes to show how difficult their situation was and what desperate refugees they were, which is something I've hoped to get across in this book. In the second section, we look mostly at Germany and what happened in the American sector of Germany, but doesn't look at what happened in the British sector, which is something I've been researching recently, so it's always something we can talk about that later. It looks at how badly the DPs, the displaced persons, were cared for by the American army, and it looks at the really incredible role of one particular man, Abraham Klausner, who was a young rabbi who played the role of Moses here, really. And then the second two sections volumes look really at the story of the Exodus. It looks at what happened in Italy, which is a story which is has never really been talked about and hasn't been told in English in any form before this, about how the Italian Jewish community picked themselves up, dusted themselves down, and dealt with the 80,000 odd Holocaust survivors who flooded into Italy. It also shows the role of the left in Italy and the partisans, and how they supported the Jewish community in helping the Jews when they arrived. And it also tells the story of contemporary politics, of how the left used this story to hit the right on the head over the refugee crisis that has engulfed Italy in recent years. And then the final story is a really exciting one, because it's the story of the boat itself. And let me show you. Here is a wonderful model of the Josiah Wedgwood. And the Josiah Wedgwood was a Canadian corvette, and they're famous for their rolling action. So sailing on the Josiah Wedgwood was a horrible experience. And it then tells the story of how the Holocaust survivors were received when they actually arrived in Israel. Much of this surprised me. In fact, much of what I discovered surprised me, because although I always felt that I knew quite a lot about the Holocaust, I began to realize that I actually knew nothing. And my husband says that my new mantra is, the more you know about it, the less you know. And I would say the more you know about it, the worse it gets. Because there were many days in writing this book and talking to survivors that I just had to basically push away my computer and go to the shops. Actually, I bought a lot of clothes, I have to admit. And I think that before we go on to open up to a general discussion, because I'm sure lots of people have questions about this, for those of you who had read the book, I think you might find it interesting to know a little bit about me. Simon gave a brief introduction. I do make some references in the book to my life, but I think it will help you to understand. Firstly, lots of people assume that I wrote this book because I'm married to somebody who's Jewish. In everyday life, I'm Mrs. Judah. And I do say that in the book because quite rightly, the Holocaust survivors say to me, what are you doing here and why are you interested? White House is not a Jewish name. And so I always say, well, actually, my other name is Mrs. Judah. But actually, my younger daughter said to me when I started to give talks about the book, come on, Mummy, you would have written this book if you've never met Daddy. And I think that is true. But before we dustbin my husband, I think there is something that you need to know about our life together and how that fed into the writing of this book. As I mentioned, we went to live in Romania immediately after the revolution. And my husband's a foreign correspondent, and he specializes in war and genocide. So there's the background knowledge of this book has been building over the decades since 1989, in my experience. We then moved from Bucharest to go to live in Belgrade, and my husband covered the entire war in the former Yugoslavia, and he's also covered the peace. He's the Balkans correspondent for The Economist. And when we were living in former Yugoslavia, at that time I had 3 very young children, and I had to explain to them what was going on. I had to tell them, don't be rude to the man with the Kalashnikov, and explain why Daddy's boots were covered in mud from a mass grave, and then deal with their macabre interest of who was in it and how the man who used to park our car had probably murdered them. So there was war swirling all around, well, all of my life, because my husband's covered many, many conflicts, and it was no accident that the book began in Ukraine and that I was in Kiev, because I was in Kiev because my husband has covered for decades the conflict in Ukraine. And actually the trip to Rivne was a weekend off when we went to Rivne. So it may not feel like that when you read the book, but this is also, I feel very at home in these areas, in this part of the world. We spent much of our working lives driving around in Eastern Europe and talking to people about how how history has become weaponized. So, you know, a family holiday was spent in Western Ukraine, bombing up and down the potholed roads, explaining to the children what was going on. And I think that then also there's a third story, which I think those of you who may have found the Polish chapter of interest, which comes from my background before I met my husband. And although, as I said, I didn't grow up in a Jewish household, I did grow up surrounded by people who had experienced the Holocaust, which is something at the time I thought was completely normal, but I subsequently realized was not. Not only was our next door neighbor a person who'd come on Nicholas Winton's Kinder transport, but my father's best friends, he was a surgeon and he worked in a hospital here in London, and his two best friends at the hospital, who were also doctors, were Poles. One was Jewish and one was not, and they were best of friends, and they had survived the Cattean Forest massacre together. They'd fought up Italy at Monte Cassino, and they were both married to women who had survived Auschwitz. One was Jewish and one was not. The Jewish lady had lost her family in Auschwitz, her very, very small children, and her husband. And the non-Jewish lady had been operated on by Dr. Mengele. She'd been taken to Auschwitz after the Warsaw Uprising. She was in the resistance. My father, as I mentioned, was a surgeon, and she was just one of the many people who were abused by Dr. Mengele's team that came into his clinic, and he operated on people who had been abused by Dr. Mengele. So literally my father's hand went where Dr. Mengele's hand went. So as a little child, as a budding journalist, I was interested in the gory aspects of what he did every day. And I was very interested in this story. So as a small child, I was amazed that there could be good doctors and bad doctors. It was a revelation. But my father also traveled extensively in Eastern Europe. So as a teenager, we would go with him when he was on university exchange programs to Eastern Europe. And we spent a lot of time in Poland in the 1970s. And I remember the very first time I went to Poland, I could not understand why no one was talking about the Holocaust. When people did talk about it, it was in hushed tones where everyone was talking as loud as they possibly could about it in our house. And I couldn't understand also, as I began to grow up and to learn more about the Holocaust, this antipathy between the Polish Jews and non-Jews, which was not something that I had seen in my childhood experience. So much of what drove that chapter when I went to Poland was to try to find an answer to this and try to find out what had changed. I mean, I think that one of the very important things that I did learn is that both of my father's friends came from the elite. They came from very, very prestigious backgrounds, both of them. And of course, as I write in the book, one of the first problems that happened was when the Nazis came in and they shot the elite, regardless of what nationality they were. And I think that that's also, to me, was very important. So there was a personal drive in this. And actually, since I've written the book, I've actually come to ask myself quite a few questions about it. And one of which is, well, why did nobody else write this? At the time of writing, I would have moments when I thought, I've just gone completely insane. Why do I think this is such a fascinating story? And why aren't there all these other books there? When you have being an author and researching a book like this is quite a lonely experience, because your nearest and dearest get fed up about hearing about it. So you're often left alone late at night thinking, have I just gone crazy? Is this mad? And also, as I said before, at this point, I didn't have an agent, and I certainly didn't have a publisher. And so that was the main focus, is that it was actually, is this a proper story, and trying to ascertain and keep digging and digging and digging to satisfy myself. But I think it's interesting why the story wasn't told before. And I think there are a number of principal reasons. One is, quite obviously, the deep freeze of Stalinism. The other one is the reluctance of Americans to admit to this, because and I grew up watching John Wayne movies about the Second World War, in which the Americans were heroes. I'm afraid I discovered General Patton was a virulent anti-Semite, and that's not really a story that Hollywood ever wanted to tell. But when I got to Italy, I began to understand something much more fundamental, and that was, in fact, actually, that Golda Meir had said that this story would be told over her dead body. time has passed and now you can tell this story, because this is a story of Jewish rescue. And Ada Sereni, who is one of the central characters and one of the many strong female characters that are in the book, she then went on to help the Soviet Jewry. And immediately after this story concludes, of course, it's the rescue of Jews from Arab lands. And those rescues have not finished, but they are carried out in a different format and in a different way. So in fact, you can tell this story today and you can talk about it, because when Jewish communities are being rescued, the whole system is completely different. And then again, I think that the story wasn't told because of the question of how those survivors were actually received when they arrived in Israel. So there hasn't been a drive coming from Israel either to tell this story. So I hope that's given you a feeling of the book, and for those of you who read it, a feeling about me. And I'm willing to take any questions that you're willing to ask me.
I have a question, Rosie. This is Robin Cohen. I love the end of the book when you told us about each person and what became of them. That was just incredible. How did you go about, was that part of your research?
Yes, it was, because they really became my people, and I tend to think of them about my people. I'm quite defensive about them, actually, and I love the way that the people are all on the front cover of the book. I was so excited when I saw this picture, because I can identify one or two of them, which is so exciting. But yes, I did think from very early on that I wanted to do this, because you know, Holocaust memorials can be really frustrating when you just see a name. So, for example, my husband's grandmother's name appears on on 2 walls now in France, but it doesn't tell you anything about it. It doesn't tell you anything about what was going through her head or the experiences that she'd had. And I didn't want to just simply list their names, and that's why, as I mentioned earlier, part of the idea of this book is that that I will find more people, and we will begin to put together perhaps a wider picture that isn't there. Because something that really began to strike me when I was looking into, I mean, I was hunting for stories, so there was the list which was gathering up, but I was also struck by the wide extent of Jewish resistance that was being revealed in front of me in actually in ghettos and places that I had never heard of. And I really felt that this was a very important thing to record.
Well, you had a survivor who got his PhD afterwards from the London School of Economics, where my son went for his master's from the United States. And it was such a big accomplishment to go to that school. And when we think about somebody who was a refugee in a totally different language, who managed, so I really got a feeling for the people, and I could relate to them on different levels by that. So thank you.
Well, actually, thank you for saying that nice thing about the London School of Economics, because I'm a graduate of the LSE. That's where I met my husband, and in fact,
that's where my son met his wife.
Oh, there we go. The LSE dating agency, but also it is a great school, and also it played a really important role in helping Holocaust survivors after the war, because of Harold Lasky and because of Neville Lasky, who was there, and many of the child survivors who came to the UK were admitted to the LSE without professional qualifications, and they were given a chance to study for their degrees. So there is a hidden LSE story, actually, which at some point needs to be written, and that their role needs to be acknowledged.
Oh, I hope you do that. I'd love to know more about it.
Good.
Hi, Rosie. Just wanted to say that the beginning of the book, which you mentioned started in the Ukraine, was particularly poignant for me, because you spoke about Rovna or Rivna. Is it called now Rivna? And it was.
It's now called Rivna. Yes. I mean, I tend to think of it as Rivna because, I mean, I went there, and it was the first time I'd actually heard of the place, to be quite honest. So in my brain, it stuck as Rivna.
My father, my late father's family, well, his parents came from Rivne, and their parents and all got murdered in the Holocaust, and their brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts. So it was particularly important for me to read that first chapter and learn a bit more about the massacre in the forest, the pine grove there. And I realized the way you were writing the book, like a bit like an investigative journalist. We've actually got a son who's an investigative journalist, so I noticed the patterns of writing in it. That this is the kind of book that really should go into educational institutions and be used, you know, like in schools and universities, rather than books like, you know, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas and The Tattooist of Auschwitz and those kind of genre type of books, because you went into such trouble, you know, researching it and backed it all up with so much evidence. And it's so much better to do it that way than to have someone imagining a conversation in Auschwitz between two inmates or something like that, you know, putting dialogue into the mouths of people when they weren't actually there. And I think it's a really, really important book to have in Jewish Book Week and Jewish educational institutions and schools and universities. And I really thank you for that. Thank you for helping me with my family history.
Well, firstly, thank you for saying that, because I think it is important. And, you know, when I was writing this book, I often had young people in my mind. As I told you, you know, I grew up well, I literally did grow up because I had the children when I was quite young, explaining to them about genocide, because of course, you know, my husband covered the genocide in Srebrenica. He was one of the few people to go into Srebrenica during the siege, and so I've always had that feeling that you need to be as chatty as possible in order to bring people in. But in previous books that I've written, that has been important. And I have been speaking in schools, and I have been really pleased that young people have found this book easy to read, because I think that so many books are so daunting and they're so heavy, and that I'm glad that it's worked, because there was at one point some talk about taking me out of this book, and I absolutely flatly refused, because I thought, you take me out, the book, what's left of this book, really? Because it's been there to try to take people by the hand. And I think particularly audiences that I've spoken to in America have actually liked the way that they're almost in the car with me, in places which are very remote and which they find quite threatening, and are very frightened of. But I also, going back to Rivne, I found Rivne an absolutely fascinating place. And I think that it's so important, because the Rivne story shows you the importance of the partisans and it shows you how they realized that they were firstly on their own in rebuilding their Jewish communities, because the people in Rivne believed that they could start a new life in Rivne, which makes complete sense when you think about it, because the massacre had been brought upon their heads, even though there were Ukrainian collaborators, by an invading army. So once the army had gone, you should imagine that everything would come to an end. The problem that they faced was something actually completely different, about the way that the ground rules had changed during the Second World War, and they were now in the middle of a civil war. But I felt that the role that partisans take, and then the way that they lead the people out. And then, as I say, when the Wedgwood is actually sailing, it's the partisans who take much of the lead in running the boat, in carrying the sick buckets, carrying the water buckets, is that this is actually the continuation of Jewish resistance. And it's a DIY survivors help, and you see that all the way down the line until you get to Italy, and you begin to see that the parties, the left and the former Italian partisans join in and begin to help them, which is a rarity. And I think that we forget at our peril that this resistance did not stop at the moment of liberation. And I found particularly the role of Abba Kovner so interesting in this, because he's you want to feel good about people, but he makes me feel so bad because he had this plot to murder 6 million Germans. And so you ricochet with the Kovner story from good to bad to downright wicked, in my opinion. And then he reinvents himself by writing this incredible text, which I think is one of the most interesting texts that I've ever seen, and actually probably one of the most frightening books about the Holocaust that I've seen, which is his book in which he describes the Holocaust as if it's a Jewish Holocaust. And to actually see at the side of the page comments written for people to read in 1,000, 2,000 years, like we read the Book of Esther, is unnerving beyond belief. And it was even more unnerving that I got my copy of the book remaindered from a library in Illinois with redundant material stamped on the front.
Can I particularly liked, I mean, I didn't know much about what you spoke about, the Jewish Brigade and how they broke away and how they kind of became one of themselves. So I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about how you discovered about the Jewish Brigade, or whether that was something you knew about before.
No, it wasn't something I knew about before. I think a large of what you read in the book was not something I knew about before, to be perfectly honest. I had no idea that they fought up Italy. I had no knowledge of the way that they had helped Italian Jewry and rebuild their lives, nor what had happened in Tarvisio, where the British government parked them up on the Austrian and what's now the Slovene border, in probably the worst place that the British Army could have parked them. And their story is in itself, again, an extraordinary story of Jewish self-help, in the way that these soldiers were selling on the black market their alcohol rations, they were stockpiling petrol, they were stockpiling clothes, they were stockpiling blankets, they were doing absolutely everything they could for the moment that they were able to cross the border and go AWOL, literally, into Austria. And the one thing that I found very interesting is that in the book, I discovered a story of about 80 young boys who were liberated in Austria. And 76 years ago, those boys were enduring some of the worst moments of their life because they were on the death marches which had left Auschwitz. And I stumbled across their story listening to testaments in Royal Holloway College. Literally, I spent about 15 hours listening to testaments there, and left literally in the middle of the night. But I realized that I'd found a story nobody else had told, and I used the death march list to match them up with the passenger ship to reveal their story. And then I was able to put them together, and they had literally gone feral after the liberation, and they were living in many of them were living in Graz train station, and they wouldn't listen to anybody. As they said, they were absolutely appallingly behaved. They say so in the book, until the Jewish Brigade pop up. And when they suddenly saw the Star of David on the vehicles and on the guns, they suddenly turned around and they found people that they would listen to. And so the rule of the impact of the actual Jewish Brigade is enormous. But of course, it didn't last very long, because they were quickly moved out by the British when the British realized what was going on, and they were moved to Belgium. But then there's this incredible story of this phantom Jewish Brigade, which was put together by Yehuda Arazi, where they were using stolen British trucks and driving around to different British bases, collecting supplies, which they were then giving to the survivors. And it's the total irony of the whole story is that actually my people were driven to the beach in Vardo in British Army trucks. It's just so audacious. It's actually quite funny.
There's
Marlene,
you're muted. If you want to unmute yourself, then we can hear you.
Yeah, two questions, Rosie. One about Ukraine. Did you ever come across a place called Lipovich?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, I've only ever seen it mentioned once.
Okay.
which was in the Jewish Museum in Paris. The other question is about the Survivors Seder. I found that so moving, and I wonder if there are any copies of the Haggadah that one could have a look at.
Yes, I've actually got one, and in fact, now at Passover, we read from that as well. It's very moving, and you can. I just found mine on Amazon, but you can see at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum they do have these pictures of these woodcuts that you and there's actually a talk by one of the curators about that book. Yes, I mean, that, of course, actually, I talk about two seders, the big dramatic seder that Abraham Klausner holds in Munich, and the culmination of the hunger strike in La Spezia, when the seder is actually held on the quay, and that story is retold in Uris's novel Exodus, and in fact in the film Yehuda Arazi, who I write about in the book, is played by Paul Newman, but actually there's a funny add-on to this to that story which isn't in great detail in the book, but I went to La Spezia when I'd actually gone to do something else, and I decided that I would try to follow up on the story of this quayside because I'd read that it was about to be demolished. So I thought it's a great story, and I went to interview the mayor of La Spezia, who has a splendiferous office overlooking the Bay of La Spezia, which is obviously home to Byron and Shelley and one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I said to him, why are you knocking down this incredibly important quayside? And then he got quite tense looking, and he said, who are you writing this for? And I said, The Observer. And then he disappeared into the back office, and there was a sort of a lot of loud shouting in Italian, and then he came out and he said, the quayside will be preserved and there will be a monument. And he said, you made me very uncomfortable because in fact my grandmother was one of the people of La Spezia who brought food for the Jews so that they could celebrate this Seder. So that was actually one of those nice moments when it's a nice moment when you're being a journalist going around asking questions and you suddenly think, well, I won a little victory there. So there are these two important Seders, and I think that, like the first Yom Kippur after the war, these religious ceremonies were really, really important for survivors. And a lot of people, particularly when I've spoken in schools, children are very interested in this role of religion and how that gave the people agency and hope. And it's not necessarily a question of believing in a philosophical idea of God. It's actually also remembering your family, and not doing Seder is actually rejecting your parents in this way. And I think it's interesting for the kids to understand that.
Thank you.
There's a posting by Michael Sharp, if I may quote you, Michael. He refers to an Israeli film directed by Yael Katzir called Shores of Light, which focuses on the Jewish DPs, displaced persons in Puglia in southern Italy on the southeastern coast, from my knowledge of the place. Is this a book you know about, and was it relevant to what you were doing?
Yes, it is absolutely relevant to what I'm doing, because I became interested in the group of Greeks who traveled on the boat, because it was a chance to talk about Thessalonica. And I thought that they might have a different story to everybody else. So I was very keen to try to track them down. And actually watching that film led me to the museum in Santa Maria di Bagni, which I write about in the book. And that discovery, in fact, led me to Moshe Haya Leon, because they gave me his daughter's email. So yes, it was one thing led to another. So, which is why the book. I mean, the book took a long time for many reasons, because, on top of it all, my husband was actually dramatically ill and almost died in the middle of me trying to write it. And I had to up my own personal earnings, and I had to shoot off. And one of the things I actually did was ghostwrite the memoirs of a North Korean defector, which, although it's within the same kind of ballpark, took me away from my work to another completely area of stuff. So, but a lot of it was because it was a really slow build. It was literally like building a castle in Lego. It was like one brick after another, and then going back to rebuild it because you just discovered something else. And yes, I found Moshe Haya Leon was he was just so moving, because the way that he had processed his trauma in a different way by writing poetry was such a revelation. I can't tell you how moving it was to sit in his office with the lights of Tel Aviv twinkling out of the window and hear him singing to me. It was incredibly moving, and I really hope that the book gets across the idea that this is a living story, and that, I mean, I don't have to tell that to all of you here, but I think to people who are not Jewish, that's really, really important message to get across.
Rosie, when will we be able to read your memoirs?
I did write a book about 13 years ago, actually, about bringing up my kids, because but I'm afraid it's out of print now. But yes, it did. It finished with the war, with the invasion of Iraq, because my husband was in Baghdad during the invasion, which was actually, he refused to leave when all the other journalists did. I've always had a feeling that it's his Holocaust story that drives him forward with that, because if there are no journalists, that's when horrible things happen, and there's no one there to tell you what's going on. There were no journalists in Auschwitz, there were no journalists in the Sasenki forest, and he stayed behind in Baghdad, as he's told me many times when he stayed behind in the siege of Dubrovnik. You know, someone's got to be there. Yes, it was actually dealing with that. By this time I had a 15-year-old, and the youngest were how old? They've been then 3 or 4, and you're actually dealing with things on a very different level. And I mean, at one point I was speaking to my husband, and we were discussing my eldest daughter, who wasn't doing very well at school at the time, and a cruise missile slammed into the building next door to him, and you kind of just wonder sometimes. But I think that this experience actually really helped me with the survivors, because I always tell them that, and so they kind of understand that I understand that, like, war is ludicrous, and 1 minute it can be like completely normal, and literally just down the road something horrendous is going on. And in that sense, our family photograph albums reveal that you go from, you know, pictures of my husband at war and burning buildings, and then somebody having a birthday, and then the gory ones have always been hidden under the bed, you know, not for public viewing. But I think it does help, and it has helped me with them, and it helped them to open up to me, and I think it helped me to understand what to ask them. I think it made a bridge, a very important bridge with them. And I write about that in the case of Manak and Kriegel, who, when I told him about my husband and how he'd been reporting from Ukraine, that then he opened up and told me that he was hidden by a Ukrainian nationalist. And I don't think he would have told me that story if I hadn't have had these experiences in Ukraine.
I saw, Michael, you've noted that you bought one of those Haggadot online. It's by a guy called Shiner. Is that his name?
Yes, I think so.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it was easy to get. I would like to get one myself. I mean, I read from what you wrote. In Hebrew, we say Avodim hoyinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and they say we were slaves to Adolf, to Hitler in Romania and Germany. In other words, they identified themselves as being just like those slaves that come out of slavery into liberation, and just like the slaves, they couldn't just immediately be ready if they were tested. They had to discover choice and independence and history and so on in a much faster length of time than
That's it, Simon. Yeah. It's published by JPS, by the Jewish Publication Society. I think I'm like you. I try to bring Seder up to date with more historically recent events. So I've already been through the Haggadah, so sort of photocopying pages that I want to use this Seder night.
Right.
Actually, I remember actually it was Passover when my husband was in Baghdad just after Saddam Hussein fell, and all the other journalists were standing around looking at the statue coming down. But his surname's Judah, so he comes from a Baghdadi Jewish family.
Yeah.
And he shot off to find the last Jews of Baghdad, who were then spirited out of the country. And I remember him shouting down the phone to me, "It's a real Passover." And, that's a more contemporary story.
Yeah. I look forward to getting one. I shall immediately after this try. Yeah. just for your information, I am not a person who's been to LSE, but my Esther certainly is too. So you can be the
Form a
alumni
club.
together. Any other questions? Hannah. No, not Hannah. Hannah's grandma. Sorry.
What's your name, Hannah's grandma?
Pat.
Pat.
I think it's because I sent her my link to get on, so that's why I think she's under as my name. Everybody,
That is
sorry.
why I'm under Hannah's name. I just wonder. I mean, I knew there were boats that left from Italy. Why do you think that this particular area had no publicity whatsoever?
I think one of the reasons is that firstly, this was not. I mean, let's call it what it was. It's people smuggling.
Yes.
And then this was also arms smuggling, because there were arms on the Wedgwood, and the young boys who were on the deck of the Wedgwood were busily throwing them over as the British landed. Now, it's one thing to own up about people smuggling, but it's not necessarily something you want to own up about arms smuggling, particularly as the war was heating up so dramatically. And then you see later on that it doesn't, the left in Italy become increasingly pro-Palestinian. So they're not going to admit that they were actually arming the people who they're now criticizing. And I think that also meant that people didn't talk about it for a long time. And I think that it was also a completely and utter top secret operation. And I think that we tend to also think about people not telling people about what they'd done during the war as something that, for example, somebody who hid a Jew in Poland or Ukraine would not talk about it. And we assume that the divided dangerous societies were not in Western Europe. But in fact, it was quite a dangerous thing to talk about immediately after the war. And there were plenty of fascists in people's towns. And in fact, not that long ago, I wrote a story of a family who'd just come forward to say that they hid an Italian Jewish lady from Milan throughout the war, but they had never spoken about it because of the number of fascists who were in their town. I wrote this piece for the Jewish Chronicle about 2 years ago, I think now. And that's unusual. You don't hear that story very often in Italy, but I think that we have to remember that about Italian society, that it was very divided in this immediate post-war period. And that goes for France as well.
Any other questions for Rosie? You've exhausted us, I think. You haven't exhausted me, but I'm questionless. It's been a real privilege for you to speak with us about this book, and all the hard work you did really is valued, and we're grateful. So any of you who have not finished reading it, I definitely confirm you should, because it's worth it. It's a fantastic book. So thank you. And I know from the earlier conversation we had that, unlike Philippe Sands, who I definitely have a massive regard for and his wonderful books, he does have a whole team helping him. And my understanding from you, Rosie, is you have no team, you have a couch. You don't even particularly have a desk. So, you know,
Absolutely.
all off to you.
Absolutely, and also if you're involved in Holocaust education, you know, I'm around to talk to people and talk about the wider work that I do, because I work as the historical advisor to the 45 Aid Society. So I can also talk about the children who came here and their wider experiences that they had on the continent, because many of those children were in the American zone, so experienced exactly these stories that I've been writing about. And I think it's brought that work that I've done there brings an interesting perspective on their lives, and actually the experiences that they had in the 6 months before those who came from the American sector. That's 6 months before they came to the UK. So there are a lot of interlinking stories here. And yes, I'm very keen to speak to anyone who's interested in.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you
Sounds
very
great.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you everyone for attending. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll get some sandwiches in a few months' time.